Hi everybody, this is June 30th, 2026, and I've been posting these videos as a form of therapy in my recovery from trauma, watching my little brother Paul Cairns, 64 with Down syndrome, be locked away by the British Columbia New Democratic Party government, David Eby as leader, Nikki Sharma as Attorney General, and Sheila Malcolmson as the minister responsible for Paul's care. So this is a picture of Paul and I at Expo, on our way to Expo 67. So that was the centennial, the Canadian centennial of 100 years from Confederation on July 1st of 1867. So we were visiting some family on the way to Montreal. At that time we were living in Sudbury. So that's me and Paul. I was 11 and he would have been 8 or 9. So I'm thinking about, so Paul, in a nutshell, Paul was locked away when I complained. I discovered that the government, the BC government, as I said, David Eby as leader, had created a secret and what I alleged was a fraudulent forged power of attorney to give Paul the COVID-19 shot on February 6th of 2021. And I didn't find out for more than a year. And when I did, I complained to the Burnaby RCMP police that the document was a fraud and a forgery. And I knew it was a forgery because I taught Paul to print the only word that he could ever print or read, his first name, Paul. It took me about a year as a little girl. I taught him P and then A and then U and then L. So here's a sample. It'll be backwards. But that's a sample of actually his signature. But it was much more, it was Paul and much better written. It was forged to make him look more intellectually capable than he was, so that they could appoint my 82-year-old Catholic nun sister 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario as Paul's guardian. Even though she had only met Paul a few times over the course of his life, she had moved out when he was born. She didn't understand his speech or communication. They wanted somebody that they could control and to whom Paul could not complain because she didn't understand his speech or communication. So Paul was locked up for 588 days in his group home. After I complained, I did everything I could think of legally and civilly to restore his visits, including applying to become his guardian and then applying just to restore his visits. But I was not successful. And the nun in Ontario did not move Paul to be closer to her, and she did not move here to be closer to him. So he was left alone and isolated and confined, locked away in his group home for 588 days until he had a stroke. And I got a call from her lawyer. The Catholic Church, I estimate, spent more than $2 million on her legal representation, trying to uphold this fraudulent and forged document. And she had 2 law firms working for her around the clock, Charles Gibson in Ottawa, an Ontario firm, and Borden Ladner Gervais, a law firm, probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest law firm in Canada. And her Vancouver lawyer was Casey Deanshaw. So they locked Paul away for 588 days until I got an email from the Vancouver lawyer, Casey Deanshaw, saying that Paul had had a stroke and I could visit him I could arrange a visit with him. And so I dropped everything and I raced to the hospital, and I was allowed a 10-minute per day visit with Paul. The nun had let Paul, he had had the stroke 2 days earlier. He laid alone with no one there. They didn't inform me for 2 days. She was waiting to see if he would die. People do very strange things when they're afraid of going to prison. I think that's what was going on with her. But he lay alone for 2 days, and then I was only allowed a 10-minute visit. But he appeared to be recovering remarkably well. I was just shocked. I was so surprised. He sat up, he grabbed a book from my hand, turned the pages perfectly. He grabbed my hand and squeezed it so tight when I said my name. He appeared to understand what I was saying. He made good eye contact. And he was struggling so hard. Paul loved life. He was struggling so hard to recover. Life had been so cruel to him. He's only 2 years younger than me, but it's like I won the jackpot of life as far as DNA goes or genetics go. And he just lied. He was born with Down syndrome, and the doctors advised my parents to institutionalize him when he was born. My dad, who'd worked underground as a safety engineer in the Sudbury nickel mines for 20 years, said, hell no. And he took Paul, when Paul was ready to be discharged as a newborn, my dad went down to Toronto from Sudbury and brought Paul back by himself on the train. My mother hesitated to, she was depressed, I think, when she didn't know how to deal with Paul's diagnosis of Down syndrome. But eventually she came around and she turned one of our bedrooms. She refitted it into a classroom and made the first preschool for children with Down syndrome in Ontario. She got a beautiful letter, a handwritten letter from Robert F. Kennedy, and with his signature signed in blue ink, thanking her for her work with disabled children. And my dad framed that letter and hung it by the front door. I think it was the item he was most proud of in our household. Anyways, today and I forgot to mention that after Paul died, or he didn't die, he was recovering. But I got a phone call when I was in the hospital waiting to visit him from the Burnaby RCMP, a staff sergeant, saying the RCMP police had been ordered by Ottawa to reopen the investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. I was thrilled. I thought, finally, after 588 days, somebody's finally paying attention. The police are going to finally do something. And so he said that they were ordered to, as I said, to investigate the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. I went to court the next morning and I asked the judge to suspend the nun's guardianship of Paul pending. As I said, the government had appointed her as his guardian because she didn't understand his speech and she wouldn't be able to understand any complaint that he might have. And when the nun found out that I'd been contacted by the RCMP and that they were going to reopen the investigation, she already knew. She had been informed a month earlier. But as soon as she found out, Paul had to die. And when I got back from the courthouse that day, all of Paul's medical supports had been removed. He had a ventilator and an oxygen mask that had been removed. I believe his intravenous was removed. And he appeared to me to be dead. I believe that they sedated him to death. They did medical assistance in dying on him. The nun ordered the doctor, although even in Canada, an incapable person cannot be euthanized. They have to be able to consent. And Paul wanted to live. When I got back from the courthouse and I got to the hospital, I can see that I walked into the room and the nun said to me, say goodbye to Paul, he's dying. But she wouldn't look me in the eye. And when someone won't look you in the eye, you know they're lying. He wasn't dying. I believe he was already dead. He was completely still. His hand was still and cool to the touch. And his eyes were wide open when his pupils were dilated and fixed. And none of that had been the case when I visited him before. So I believe that when she thought that if he was dead, then the RCMP couldn't investigate the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. And she was right, because I never heard from them again. They never investigated. Although I wrote them and I asked them to treat Paul's death as suspicious. I complained to the coroner and I complained to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. The nun had ordered Paul's treating doctor, as I said, to kill Paul. And that's even with Canada's euthanasia laws, that's not allowed. So I complained to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, but nobody ever responded. So, and after Paul died, the nun, in order to prevent me from complaining about his death, applied to have me designated permanently a vexatious litigant. Now, at that time, I was 69, and I had first been a psychologist for the government of British Columbia, working with mentally handicapped adults in a large institution. And I was responsible for assigning IQs and developing behavior therapy programs for mentally handicapped adults. Then, in an effort to try and help disabled people, I went to law school. And I graduated as the first single mother to graduate from law school in British Columbia history. And my first job as a lawyer was working as a federal prosecutor, prosecuting the Criminal Code of Canada and the Controlled Substances Act. And then I actually worked for Carrie Lynn Finley, hired me as her junior. And then I went out on my own and I had my own practice. So I practiced law for 23 years. But notwithstanding all of that and my success as a lawyer, I am disabled. I was disabled in an accident in 2008 and I stopped practicing in 2016. But notwithstanding that, all of that, and my success as a lawyer, the nun applied to have me designated permanently a vexatious litigant and went on for a hearing that lasted for 2 full days. Although I had a heart attack in 2016 and I can't be in court by doctor's orders. I have certificates saying that I can't be in court for longer than 2 hours per day. But of course, the judge, with all of these high-powered lawyers, let them just go and fill their boots, and they went on for 2 days, and at the end, she designated me permanently vexatious litigant, which takes away all of my access to Canadian courts, except for the federal courts and the Supreme Court of Canada. I applied to set that aside, the Supreme Court of Canada, and I was not granted leave to appeal. So that's where things stand now. After I was designated a vexatious litigant, Paul had died, and I wasn't in a position to fight for his freedom any longer. I looked into this medical assistance in dying in Canada, euthanasia in Canada, and I discovered, and that's what I want to talk about today. Tomorrow is the 159th anniversary of Confederation, and actually my great-grandfather was Sir John A. Macdonald, who is considered the father of Confederation. My great-grandfather was his law partner. His name was Jim Mulligan in the law firm of Macdonald, Marsh & Mulligan in Toronto on Queen Street. So, and we had a big hand-drawn portrait of Sir John A. Macdonald and pictures of his family. I thought everyone was related somehow to Sir John A. Macdonald when I was a little girl. But Canada is obviously a big deal for us. And I actually, when I was a teenager, when I was 16, I hitchhiked across Canada. I traveled across Canada. I hitchhiked when I was 16 from Montreal to Vancouver. And I've hitchhiked across British Columbia several times. And I've also hitchhiked to Miami from Montreal. And you really get to know a country and you get to see it from the ground up. When you hitchhike, you meet so many people and you learn just so much about a country. And so it's very heartbreaking for me to see the depths to which the Liberal Pierre Trudeau and then Justin Trudeau and then finally Mark Carney has dragged Canada into the depths of hell. And I'm directing this video to young men. In my mind, like you'll find this out when you get older. I'm 70. When you get older, in your head, you're always a certain age, and in my head, I'll always be 19. But when I think of young men, you've got the access to turn Canada around. And Canada has, with this euthanasia, Canada has killed, in the last 10 years, Canada has killed extrajudicially by lethal injection more than 100,000 innocent, vulnerable Canadians. Canada killed 45 Canadians today They killed 45 Canadians yesterday. They pay regular doctors and nurses. All it takes is the signature of any doctor, any nurse, and that of the person that's to be killed. And they're given a lethal injection in the same way that convicted criminals in the United States are put down by lethal injection. But the convicted criminals in the United States have every possible legal recourse. It takes many years, 20 decades, for them to be executed, whereas all it takes is the signature, as I said, of any doctor, any nurse, and the person on a piece of paper. It's not a sworn affidavit. There's no judge involved. That's why I say it's extrajudicial. So all of the protections of the individual against the state that have been put in place in Western civilization, starting with the Magna Carta in 1215, have been completely erased by starting with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was created by Pierre Trudeau, who I remember. I lived near in Montreal, and they've used that to supersede the wishes of Parliament. In the British common law tradition, Parliament is supposed to supersede everything because Parliament is the wishes of the people. But Pierre Trudeau came up with this document called the Charter, and bizarrely, in 2015, the 9 civil servants, 9 unelected people, the Supreme Court of Canada, who are all they are. They're not elected. They're just judges appointed by the Prime Minister of the day. Changed the law of first-degree murder so the government could kill extrajudicially anybody, and purportedly it's with the person's consent. But, having a background in psychology, consent is a very complex concept. It's part of social approval. I mean, there's anorexia nervosa, where people starve themselves to death because they see themselves as being fat. So consent is very complicated. And my argument against euthanasia in Canada is, number one, is that nobody can give informed consent to being killed. Medical procedures require informed consent. They have to know what you're signing up for, and nobody knows what death is. We don't know if it's just life ceasing to have consciousness, or if it's, in my religion, I believe that you go to hell if you have mortal sin that has not been forgiven, or you go to heaven to be with Jesus and your loved ones, or you're in purgatory if your sins haven't been forgiven. Probably the most popular concept in the world of afterlife is reincarnation, where you come back as another animal or another person on different levels. But we don't know. Nobody has ever come back. And in 1976, the Parliament of Canada abolished capital punishment, hanging, on the basis that it's irreversible and people make mistakes in their choices. And my grandfather, not my great-grandfather, who was Sir John A. Macdonald's law partner, but my great-grandfather was a lawyer, then a judge, and my grandfather was also a lawyer, then a judge. And when my grandfather, Murray Mulligan, was a lawyer, he had 2 clients who ended up being hanged. One was an Indigenous man, and one was an immigrant, I think a Swedish person who didn't speak English well. And he was devastated. But at least those people had the right to have legal counsel, to be judged by a jury. And all of the proceedings were overseen by a judge. Now we've made it so any physician, any doctor or nurse is judge, jury, and executioner for a precious human being who has an important place in our society and whose life is treated as worthless. And the lethal injection that they're given is not painless, and it's not considered to be painless by any means. It is a form of paralysis where the person drowns in their own blood and their own fluids. And there's been instances of people waking up in the middle of the procedure and screaming, "Help me, help me." There's been instances of women changing their mind, and the staff, hospital staff, just going and finding another person and having them sign the document. And most recently, a woman named Miriam Lancaster had a sore back, and she went to the Vancouver General Emergency, where I've been many times. And before they even asked her a question, a young physician, a young female doctor came up and said, "We've decided to offer you MAiD." So they created this evil, made-up propaganda word, just like the Soviets did, medical assistance in dying. It isn't medical, I can tell you, because the word medical is from the Greek word, the Greek verb to heal. And you don't heal anyone by killing them. So it's a fraudulent misrepresentation. And in my view, it's murder. Now, the 9 Supreme Court justices, you change first-degree murder into a government-sponsored activity, paid for, practice, and turned murder into a medical treatment. They did that without, as I said, they were not elected, and they were not physicians themselves. And what they did was they did it to accommodate a woman who was already dead. The case was called, they reversed an earlier case where they had rejected medical doctors killing their patients. And that's a case called Canada and Sue Rodriguez. But in a case called Canada and Kay Carter, this ghoulish death advocacy, euthanasia advocacy group called Death with Dignity, which is so revolting, as if you can't die with dignity unless you have a doctor put you down like a dog. But this woman, Kay Carter, was already dead. She'd gone to Switzerland. She wasn't terminally ill. She had a spinal condition called spinal stenosis, where her spine was fusing, and she wanted to be killed. And it wasn't legal in Canada. So what the Supreme Court of Canada, she'd already gone to Switzerland and been killed. But what the Supreme Court of Canada said, it wasn't fair to her that she had to wait until she became terminally ill to be killed. And they gave the Canadian government a year to come up with a system for killing people that was fair and did not abuse the inclination of people, the desire of people to kill others, and to take advantage of weak, vulnerable, and already marginalized people. So they gave Canada, the Canadian government, a year to do something that in 40,000 years of human civilization, including Neanderthals did not kill their sick, ill, and disabled members of their society. And we know that because Margaret Mead said that there are skulls that showed catastrophic injuries that where the person recovered and the injury healed over. So we know that they didn't kill their elderly ill. It was not their practice to kill their elderly ill and disabled members of their society, because it destroys society to do that. And Homo sapiens, our species, certainly has not done it, has not killed. And the reason that we could survive under the most terrible of circumstances is because we could be in groups of 140 or more. 140 or more people could congregate together, and the stronger ones would not kill the weaker ones. Well, that's no longer the case in Canada. So my argument against euthanasia in Canada, first of all, never say MAiD, because it's a fraudulent misrepresentation to call it medical. It's not medical just because doctors and nurses do it. The worst serial killer in history was a medical doctor named Harold Shipman, who killed 250 of his patients in the UK. And the worst female serial killer in Canadian history was a nurse named Elizabeth Whitlofer. So they are not in the position to be judge, jury, and executioner and decide who should live and who should die. So again, my argument is that you might think you're being compassionate, but there's a reason why no other culture does it. There's only, of all of the 196 countries in the world, there's only 4 that allow euthanasia, and that's Switzerland, the Netherlands, Spain, and Canada. But Canada outstrips them all. It's the most efficient in the killing. Now, just one last point I wanted to make today, and thank you so much if you've made it this far. We have to my goal is to recriminalize murder, recriminalize doctors killing their patients, and we can get there. The Supreme Court of Canada, when they made this decision in February of 2015, and I know you're all not lawyers, but try and understand this. They made this decision reversing an earlier decision where they said that it was not in the best interests of society for doctors to kill their patients. So they reversed their own 20-year-old decision, saying that the charter gives you a charter right to be killed by your doctor. Now, how bizarre and ridiculous is that? The United States has already said that there is no such thing as a constitutional right to abortion. And an abortion was created for the purposes of saving the life of adult persons, of persons. And a person is defined as anyone who has been born and taken their first breath. And the reason why abortions are allowed is to protect life, to protect persons. Anyways, Canada is only going to deteriorate more. The thing about this killing of people is that it's addictive. Stephen King said, murder is like potato chips. You can't stop with just one. And that's exactly what happened to Hitler. Hitler started by killing all the ill, elderly, and disabled in the hospitals and sanatoriums in Germany. Before World War II even started, he had gassed 350,000 people. And people thought, oh, well, I guess that's the modern way. So then he went on to commit the genocide against the Jewish people and against the gypsies and against gay people. It's addictive. People like to do it. And that's exactly what's happening in Canada. It's swirling down a rabbit hole. And I cannot celebrate Canada Day tomorrow. That's been taken away from me. My government is illegitimate, that Mark Carney has bribed or stolen the allegiance of 5 members of parliament and created a false majority. And my country is in a process of a Holocaust and a genocide of my own people. These people that they're executing extrajudicially by lethal injection are 96% of European descent. So they're white people and mostly women. So it is a genocide of an identifiable group. I can't celebrate Canada Day tomorrow. And you shouldn't either. When I see people waving the Canada flag, I just think, no. So what I'm asking is young men, start by never using that government propaganda word, that evil propaganda word, MAiD. I never want to hear that. Never say it. Start with that. But just put the word out. Change people's minds. Say, no one can consent to it. It's irreversible. Parliament abolished it. Parliament abolished the killing of citizens by the government in 1976 for civilians and in 1999 for the military. And there's a logical fallacy. As I said, the Supreme Court of Canada gave Canada a year to come up with a system that would protect the rights of people from being killed unlawfully. Well, that's ridiculous. In the history of humankind, no one's ever been able to do that because people are greedy and bad, and some of them like to kill people. So it cannot be done, and that's why government killing people was abolished in 1976. Capital punishment was abolished in 1976. There's no system, and many of these people that are being killed, their organs are being harvested. And that's why they want to kill babies and what they call children. They call them mature minors. They want to kill everybody because they're harvesting their organs and sending them at a profit to the United States. The transfer of heart organ donations to the United States has skyrocketed since this evil practice. And the last thing I wanted to say is that I believe that the Supreme Court of Canada committed treason. I used to be a federal prosecutor, and I know treason. And they committed treason when they enacted this, because they enacted this making it a charter right to be killed by a doctor, which is ridiculous. And then immediately, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, went to work for the Communist Party of China in Hong Kong as a Court of Appeal judge for 6 years. Now, she was old. She got to live a good long life, and she was old in February of 2015. But then she supposedly worked for the Communist Party of China, which harvests the organs of political prisoners, kills and harvests the organs of political prisoners. And she went and worked with that evil, diabolical system that has killed more people than any other system in the history of the world. I remember as a little girl, when I was 4 or 5, my dad telling me that they had starved to death and killed 100 million people. So Beverly McLaughlin is a traitor. She created this law, making it a charter right to be killed by the government. And then she went off to work for the Communist Party of China for 6 years. She's a traitor. And I met her. I met her at a conference when I was in law school. But I know treason when I see it. And if anything, something that results in the extrajudicial execution of 100,000 Canadians, if that isn't treason, I don't know what is. So I'm sorry, but I cannot say Happy Canada Day. But I can say I love you all. Take care.